Welcome back everyone to the round 4 recap of the Superbet Chess Classic Romania. In today's games, we had two decisive results. We had Fabiano Caruana winning against Deac Bogdan Daniel with the white pieces, and Praggnanandhaa winning against Anish Giri with the white pieces. Nepomniachtchi drew Wesley So with white, Alireza Firouzja drew Gukesh with white, and Nodirbek Abdusattorov drew Maxime Vachier-Lagrave with the white pieces. After today's results, we have the following standings. Fabiano Caruana leading the tournament, sole leader, with 3 points out of 4 rounds. Then we have a tie for the second place between Praggnanandhaa and Gukesh. And then they're followed closely by MVL, Nepo, Wesley, and Firouzja. And at the bottom of the table, we have Nodirbek Abdusattorov, Anish Giri, and at the very bottom, we have Deac Bogdan Daniel. So without further ado, let's get right into the games. For our first game, we'll be looking at the game between Fabiano Caruana and Deac Bogdan Daniel. Caruana playing with the white pieces, starts the game off with d4. Knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. We have a Nimzo-Indian defense. White goes for the e3 system, castles, and then plays a3. This is a typical system to get the bishop pair right off the beginning and start potentially developing the pieces with bishop d3 and knight e2 or knight f3. And on the other hand, black gains the advantage of forcing white to have doubled pawns. c5, bishop d3, knight c6, knight e2 could have been possible, but rook b1 was played, which actually surprised Deac at this point. He probably wasn't expecting the move rook b1, so he played d6 after a 15-minute think. Knight e2, e5, hitting the center, and white simply continues his development, castles and f3, b6 and e4. So the f3 idea was to play the pawn to e4 and eventually possibly to develop his pieces, the bishop to g5, or perhaps play maybe d5 and f4 later in the upcoming parts of the game. Black didn't want to allow any of this, so he played c takes d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, e takes d4, and bishop to g5 was played. Bishop b2 was also another option for white to regain this pawn on d4, but black can reply with something like bishop to a6, putting pressure on the c4 pawn. Bishop g5 was played, rook went to e5, and the game continued with bishop h4, keeping the pin on the queen. Bishop dropped back to e2, targeting the d4 pawn, rook a5, rook b3 protecting the pawn, bishop to a6, putting pressure on the c4 pawn, and white finally regained the pawn that he has given out of the opening. Queen e5, rook d1, putting pressure on the d6 pawn. Queen was traded, and now the d6 weakness is much more clear and easier to attack. Knight went to e8, bishop dropped back to e1, attacking the rook on e5. Of course, black saw that coming. Bishop went to b4, attacking the rook. The rook had to drop the c6, and now white starts to attack with the f4. Potential ideas are to play the move e5 if allowed, with bishop f3, trying to skewer the rooks. Black doesn't want any of that, so plays rook c8, rook c3, protecting the pawn, and the white king joins the game. h5, temporarily giving this pawn, but if white were to take this pawn, black could simply take the pawn on c4 and keep the game going. Instead, white did not go for the pawn. He played h3, doesn't want to trade pawns and gaining more space. White is playing very cautiously and very slowly, forcing black to take decisions by spending quite some time. As we have already seen throughout the event, Bogdan Daniel has been spending quite a lot of time at the earlier stages of the game. So the time pressure often is very, very critical in his games. So Fabi simply just slowly improving his position, playing f5, opening up the king side, and now that king will be in some sort of trouble. The white king marching, beautiful king march by white, and now bishop e7, and after rook e3, in this position, black actually simply resigned. He cannot even take this pawn, because if he does that, then bishop takes knight would just win material, because if you take my rook, I have rook d8 check, forcing you to go king h7, and rook h8 would be checkmate, and that would win the game. Therefore, black simply resigned. And this game put Fabi at the lead at round 4. The next game that we're going to be looking at is going to be between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Wesley So. The game started off with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6, and d3. White is hoping for a anti-Berlin. The Berlin goes after castles, knight e4, d4, knight d6, and we have seen this exact line between MVL and Firouzja yesterday. So white doesn't want any of that. He doesn't want to play the endgame. He instead wants to play a complicated middle game, which is a very common way to combat this variation. We have a very standard way. Both sides are developing their pieces and relatively playing quickly, because this variation is played at the top level on a very regular basis. And black is expanding on the queen side. Both sides are playing extremely quickly, and black also strikes at the center, trying to put pressure on the e4 square. White replies with d4, but black is completely expecting this d takes e4, d takes c5. Queens come off the board, and it looks definitely like Wesley So was in full preparation right now, since he has not spent any time to reach this position. MVL goes knight e3, and this was the first think of the game by Wesley. He played the move a4. Black is potentially trying to play maybe a3, but mainly they're hoping to get knight a5 to trade off the white's bishop pair. Bishop dropped back. White is not interested in trading the bishops. Knight b4, bishop f1, rook c8, improving the pieces, bishop d5, centralizing the bishop, g4, knight c4, trying to win the pawn, but that was defended. And black actually managed to win this pawn on b2. Rook went to d6, rook e6, offering a trade, which was accepted. Now black has these doubled pawns that could potentially be weaknesses. Bishop dropped back to f5, giving up this pawn on e5. Perhaps one idea could have been to play bishop to d5 instead, and after rook takes e5, black could play this interesting looking move, knight to d1, trying to win the pawn on c3, followed by putting pressure on the pawn on a2. But this was not played, could have been played, but Wesley preferred to play bishop to f5 instead, giving up this pawn and trying to go knight e4, attacking the bishop and the pawn on c3. Bishop dropped to e3, and black replied knight to c4. Had they taken on c3, white would have replied with the move bishop d4, skewering these two knights, and that would cause black knights to be a little out of coordination, and Wesley did not indeed want this, because now the knights are kind of tied to each other. Neither knight can move, and white will probably play the move bishop g2 next, targeting the c6 pawn and eventually creating this nice pass pawn on c5. So therefore, none of that happened. Wesley dropped the knight to c4, trading finally the bishop pair. But now we have the opposite colored bishops. Black is threatening a very dangerous fork, which white defends against it. And finally, black is up a pawn again, but this is not going to be sufficient, since the nature of the opposite colored bishop endgame could lead to a draw. What white actually indeed gives up the bishop in order to get an activity and win the pawn instead. This opportunity was created because black played the move knight to f6. Perhaps he could have played something like knight f8, keeping the nature of the game still the same by not allowing the trade of the bishop for the knight. But after knight f6, the bishop took, and then rook went to d6. The pawn on c6 was picked up, but now black is creating counterplay, trying to pick up the pawn on a2. This was not allowed. Not immediately at least, because if you take this guy, I can actually play rook takes e6, followed by rook to a6, attacking the pawn on a3 and eventually picking it up. So rook c5 was played. Black got rid of one of the danger pawns of white, and white is going to try to pick the pawn on a3, which indeed happened. So now we have a more or less easy equality, and both players just repeated after some time, and the game was a draw. The next game that we're going to be looking at is between Praggnanandhaa and Anish Giri. Pragg, playing with the white pieces, has won the game and started the game with d4, d5, c4, a queen's gambit accepted. Knight f3, knight f6, e3. This is all standard theory that a lot of players repeat, and Pragg plays this move, bishop to e2. A lot of players have seen the move a4 or b3 or even the move e4. Bishop e2 is also another option that is playable for white. Knight bd2, bishop e7, dc5. Now we have a very, very symmetrical position, and very comfortable one for white, since the c8 bishop is not developed yet, and white can start playing on the queen side very quickly. So knight e4, knight takes, queen takes, rook b8, bishop b2, bishop b7, queen f4. Very logical developing moves by both sides. Knight went to f6, bishop to d3. The bishops are staring at the king side, which could be dangerous for black. And black played this move, rook d5, perhaps with the idea of playing bishop d6, rook h5, and starting a kingside attack for themselves. But this is actually not a very good move. This was indeed a blunder by Anish Giri, which was almost fully capitalized by Pragg. He played the move b4, which is correct, attacking the bishop, forcing it to go to d6. And in this position, Pragg played the move bishop takes f6. The better move would have been queen to h4, threatening to take this knight and checkmate on h7. And black cannot play this move rook h5 due to the fact that black fails after bishop takes f6, hitting the queen. So if you go rook takes h4, I take your queen, and if you take my bishop, I take your rook, and I am up material, and I will be winning the game with the white pieces. Therefore, rook h5 would not be possible, and in order to stop bishop takes f6, one idea could be to play the move e5, but that will be restricting the movement of this rook, and after the move a4, this rook will actually be trapped. We saw a very similar idea in the game, but this would have been much more forcing to win the material. This would force black to take here, and white would have a very big advantage, practically winning the game. If they play the move h6, trying to secure the h5 square, still we can play the move e4, since rook h5 is not possible due to bishop f6. So rook takes d3 is the only move, and white would be up material. Instead, in the game, bishop takes f6 was played, which is a slight inaccuracy, but black responded with a slight inaccuracy of their own. Instead, should have played the move g takes f6 in order to meet the move, queen g4 or queen h4 with f5. And if queen g4, king goes to the corner, and e4 does not win the game, because there is this move f5 hitting the queen as well as hitting the pawn that is attacking the rook. So black indeed should have played g takes f6, but they failed to do that. They played queen takes f6. In this position, it's already move number 20, but Anish has less than 10 minutes. So time was a huge factor in this game. Anish Giri had to play the game with very little time on his clock after he played the move rook d5. e4 was played, and now Pragg is up material and went on to win the game with a little ups and downs. But since Anish had very little time, I think the defensive task was indeed very difficult, and he had to be extremely precise to hold on to this position. For example, king g7 was actually a mistake. He should have played the move h5, and after takes, only then maybe play the move king g7, but this is really difficult to understand during the game. So instead, Anish played king g7, but with very little time on the clock, Pragg slowly dominated the game and went on to winning the game after a very, very long battle. They kept shuffling and shuffling, and eventually the white rooks managed to get on the 7th rank, and then the white king managed to pick up the danger pawn on h4 and then routed itself to the 7th rank, offering a rook trade. And at this point, black cannot stop the rook trade and therefore is losing the game, because the white rook will be collecting every single pawn and this pawn will make a new queen. Therefore, Anish Giri had to resign. The next game that we're going to be looking at is going to be between Alireza Firouzja and Gukesh. Alireza, playing with the white pieces, goes for d4, d5, and c4. And we see another Queen's Gambit accepted. And white played this time the move e4, as opposed to the system chosen by Pragg in the previous game. e4, e5, knight f3, e takes d4, bishop takes c4, bishop b4 check, knight bd2. This is all pretty standard theory as well for this variation. And both sides had good knowledge about the line. They were playing relatively quickly at this point. Firouzja taking some time, but Gukesh was definitely booked up. And he's really showing that maybe these are the lines he might play for the World Championship, or maybe these are lines that he might not be playing for the World Championship. So it's also a very critical thing from him and his team. And here was the first time he spent some time and he played the move c4, which is actually a very good move. So we are going to see how Gukesh will be handling his opening choices, since the match is relatively close. A lot of pieces were traded off in this game, and both sides were probably happy with a draw after how things turned out, and there was a very quick repetition. This was relatively an easy draw for Gukesh, and I don't think he minds making a draw against Alireza Firouzja with such ease at this tournament, especially with the black pieces. The final game that we're going to be looking at is going to be between Nodirbek Abdusattorov and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Nodirbek plays e4. This time he's using the king's pawn as opposed to d4 that he did earlier in the tournament. d6, d4, takes, knight f6, knight c3, a6. We have a Nodirbek, which is MVL's favorite, and white surprises him slightly with the move queen to d3. It is a much lesser played move as opposed to the other main lines, but I don't really think you can surprise MVL in the Nodirbek at this point, because he really is familiar with every single line, and he's clearly showing that he knows this by playing quickly against Nodirbek. And white actually plays this move b4. This is not something we see very often in the Nodirbek. White is actually trying to play on the queen side as opposed to the king side. So white plays a4, b takes a4, queen g3, queen to c8. So it looks like black is actually indeed surprised, because he has spent around 30 minutes and Nodirbek has not spent any minutes up until this moment, where queen c8 definitely caught him off guard, where he plays the move rook a3. It was definitely worth mentioning that rook a4 was possible and probably the best move, but instead Nodirbek decided to play the move rook to a3, defending his knight. Black goes h5, trying to go h4 and gain some space, so white prevents that, and black replies with the move e5, a very typical idea in the Nodirbek. Knight went to f3, and black actually simply just took this pawn on e4. If white takes the bishop, then black will take the bishop with the knight back and be simply up material. Knight went to g5, attacking the bishop. The bishop drops, knight takes a4, and bishop goes to e7. It's also interesting for black to play this move d5. That would have attacked this pawn on b4. And I wonder what Nodirbek had in mind, because there is a very interesting move, knight to b6 here, but I don't think it quite works after takes, bishop e7, rook e3, trying to checkmate on the e7 square, but black can simply just defend against it. and nothing would come out of this attack, at least not yet immediately. So d5 could have been an interesting move. Knight c5 is perhaps what was considered during the game, but after that black could simply take and short castle and just continue developing with a very nice center and material advantage. Bishop e7 was played instead, so white played the move c4, preventing the move d5, rook b8, bishop d2, castles, knight c3, bringing back the knight that was in the corner. Knight went to b6, rook went to c1, trying to play on the queen side still. Bishop dropped, queen went to d3, queen c6, bishop f3, knight d5. Very nice tactic. If you take my queen, I can actually take on e7 and take the queen on the next move, winning a piece. So instead, the game went with bishop d5. Black is sacrificing the queen for quite some material. There is definite compensation. Bishop went to b5, some trades off. Knight e6, a very fancy move, asking black if they want to take this. But of course, black is not interested in taking that knight, because after queen g6, king h8, queen h6 check, king g8, and then after the bishop, let's say, goes to d1, with the threat of playing the move rook to g3, the game would be completely winning for white. Therefore, black did not take the knight. They played rook f to b8, knight c7, king g7, knight d5, rook c6. Some more trades happened. Black took the pawn, that was free, but white eventually consolidated, and at this point both players just repeated and made a draw. So we had some really exciting games at the 4th round of the tournament. So after round 4, we had very exciting games. We had 2 decisive results and 3 draws. Fabiano Caruana winning with the white pieces, as well as Praggnanandhaa winning with the white pieces. So after today's games, here's how the standings look. Fabiano Caruana, sole leader of the tournament with 3 out of 4. He's closely followed by Praggnanandhaa and Gukesh. And they are closely followed by MVL, Nepo, Wesley So, and Firouzja. And at the bottom of the table, we have Nodirbek Abdusattorov, Anish, Giri, and at the very bottom, we have Deac, Bogdan, Daniel. We're going to have very exciting matchups tomorrow for round 5. MVL is playing with the white pieces against the leader, Fabiano Caruana. Gukesh will be facing Nodirbek Abdusattorov with the white pieces. Anish, Giri will be facing Alireza, Firouzja with the white pieces. Wesley So playing white pieces against Praggnanandhaa, and Deac, Bogdan, Daniel will be facing against Nepomniachtchi. Deac will have the white pieces, and he will try to get his first win at this really tough tournament. Thank you for watching the recap of round 4, and looking forward to seeing you tomorrow at the recap of round 5.